Hi there. I'm going to comment on Chapter 24 of Lila, Inquiry into Morals by Robert M. Pirsig. So I'm going to start with a couple quotes that I think these sum up the chapter pretty well, or at least give a sense of what this chapter is about. The first one is, a science in which social patterns are of no account is as unreal and absurd as a society in which biological patterns are of no account. It's an impossibility. And the next one is, when the intellectuals in control of society take biology's side against society, then society is caught in a crossfire from which it has no protection. This is an interesting chapter because it really goes into how the interactions between the levels create or denote the morality of this book, an inquiry into morals, how the metaphysics of quality is a moral system. And there's 5 different types of moralities in the metaphysics of quality, which we'll get to. Now, this begins with this sentence, or this sentence, which is the ongoing problem in this book. Does Lila have quality? The question seemed inexhaustible. The answer Phaedrus had thought of before: biologically she does, socially she does, and still didn't get all the way to the bottom of it. There was more than society and biology involved, and so we're going to see what that is exactly, because the history of where we are, the beginning of the dominance of the intellectual level, which Pirsig is going to say it is going to delineate to the end of the First World War. I mean, obviously there's been many, let's just say, latches that have, the intellectual level begins at a certain point. We're still unsure what that is. Kind of looks like it's the pre-Socratics, from what I can tell, but you could argue that. I mean, in this chapter, he's going to say that intellect evolved to, see a few steps ahead, so you could protect yourself from biology. So if that's the beginning of the intellectual level, and that's way further back than the ancient Greeks. He's setting us up for an investigation not into just Lila's quality, but an expansion of our understanding, again, of the metaphysics of quality moral system. And this chapter is very useful for that reason, because it expands on how the levels interact. And it demonstrates the standard way of running society based on subject-object metaphysics and subject-object morality, and how the metaphysics of quality is actually a better way, that it avoids the pitfalls of misattributing one set of morals to the wrong level, which is what happens all the time in what's going on these days. And we'll make some relationships between what this chapter is about and what's actually happening in the world today. And in that way, in that regard, this chapter is prescient, just like Pirsig's work in general. And we're also going to see the genesis of the culture war in this chapter. And a lot of the problems we're seeing played out in the culture war is due to conflicting moral systems. We already know that, but in terms of metaphysics of quality, this chapter is going to, it's enlightening. It's not like right versus left, which is what we think it is, conservatives versus liberals. It's much more than that. So this chapter is, I want to read this next thing. This is a great sentence. What had happened since the end of the First World War was that the intellectual level had entered the picture and had taken over everything. It was this intellectual level that was screwing everything up. So I think you have to look at the phrase taking over everything. And this chapter is going to give us some insight in exactly as to how the intellectual level is screwing things up. So keep in mind a few things we already know about the metaphysics of quality. This isn't a comprehensive list. Just let me throw a few things out there, so to remind you of what we already know when going into this. So each level has its own morality. Lower levels invent higher levels to protect them. The origins of the higher level are in the lower level, and they are indelibly linked. But they do ratchet off from the lower level, and they have a tendency to try to be independent from the lower level. And at some point, when that upper level becomes its own thing, then there's a conflict for dominance. The lower tries to take back the upper, because, it has invented this upper level for its own protection, and the upper level tries to sever away from the lower level. And this is, in fact, the upper level trying to be its own thing, trying to sever, is actually is morally justified in the metaphysics of quality on the surface. But if you're severing, if you're really cutting too sharply, if you're really dividing yourself, if the level is trying to be independent completely from the lower level, then there's going to be a mess, because the lower level supports the upper level. So even though it's moral for the upper level to dominate, it is not moral ultimately for the upper to destroy the lower level or to sever completely from the lower level, because that there's that support. And if the upper level is morally, let's just say, is morally superior, I don't think that's the word Pirsig would use, but let's just use it because I can't think of anything else right now, then if it is immoral to facilitate its own destruction. So patterns that are too rigid are stagnant, and patterns that are too dynamic become degenerate. So going one way or another, and this is where, the notion of the Tao comes in very early in Zen and the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance, that there is a certain harmony in the way patterns need to exist in the world for them to endure. And man is not only intellectual. We certainly attribute intellect to our identity for the most part, at least most people who would be inclined to read this book would. But and that may be an unfair statement, so sorry about that. But so man is not only intellectual, he's also social and biological, and all three levels have to work in unison. So that's sort of a little rehash of the metaphysics of quality that we know so far. All right, so let's go back to Rigel and that fight kind of that he had with Phaedrus at breakfast early in the book. What made Rigel mad was that into this scene, meaning where there's conflict, where society is kind of breaking down, come intellectuals like Phaedrus who say it's unintelligent to repress biological drives. You must decide these matters on the basis of reason, not on the basis of social codes. So that's what makes Rigel mad, is that he thinks that Phaedrus thinks that it's just fine what Lila's doing, because he's this intellect who has no moral system. His moral system is based entirely on reason. And Pirsig says, or Phaedrus says to himself, that Rigel has actually picked the wrong intellect to direct his ire, because Pirsig is on Rigel's side in a way in this, because he doesn't think that the intellectual level should be so dominant, should be so authoritarian, let's just say. And what he does, what the metaphysics of quality does, is it challenges the very axiomatic base of the intellectual level, which is objectivity, specifically objectivity of science. The metaphysics of quality uproots the intellectual source of this confusion, the doctrine that says science is not concerned with values, science is concerned only with fact. Is it all right to murder your neighbor is not a scientific question, but can he argue that the moral question, is it all right to fake your scientific data, is not a scientific question? Can he say, as a scientist, the faking of scientific data is of no concern to science? Okay, this is a really good sentence. If he gets tricky and tries to say that is a moral question about science, which is not part of science, then he has committed schizophrenia. He is admitting the existence of a real world that science cannot comprehend, which is probably something that a scientist who would answer that question in that way absolutely has never thought of. What the metaphysics of quality makes clear is that it is only social values and morals, particularly church values and morals, that science is unconcerned with, and that clears the whole thing up. And that's because the intellectual level is overcoming social. So there's this moral battle going on. Again, this is what a lot of the chapter is about. The intellectual level naturally tries to prevent this lower level from pulling it back down, but in this case, it is separated draconianly. And it's important to remember the morality of each level and is actually there whether you believe it or not. So if a scientist is pretending that social values don't exist and yet integrity in science is a thing, or it's not part of science, then he's skirting around the issue, but he's still referring to social values that do exist and that are there and have evolved and have been there for thousands of years. So he's going to have a tough time. He's going to have to really do some cognitive dissonance in order to avoid it, and that is what's going on. And how this begins, the very beginning of this, is in the ancient Greeks for Pirsig, where the ancient Greeks elevate truth to the highest place of the hierarchy. We've talked about this in Zen and the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance. Once this political battle is resolved, the metaphysics of quality can then go back and re-ask the question, just exactly how independent is science, in fact, from society? The answer it gives is not at all. Again, it may think it is, but it's not. For one thing, how do you come up with a hypothesis? How do you decide even what is valuable to study, and what you think the reason that you should be creating an experiment altogether is? And that means that hypotheses have to be based on value, but not inorganic value, not intellectual value, even though they think it's intellectual value, or they think they're looking at inorganic or biological material that they're studying as totally objective, and therefore the hypotheses come from that. But they don't. Atoms don't carry hypotheses about themselves around as part of their luggage. Nature tells us only what our culture predisposes us to hear. That's probably a hard thing for any of us to really understand when we first hear this sentence, but our heads are full of what culture has put there. And it, even to someone who understands Pirsig, that's a hard pill to swallow. The selection of which inorganic patterns to observe and which to ignore is made on the basis of social patterns of value, when it is not on the basis of biological patterns of value, which would be the two levels that science would presumably study. So he talks about, and to prove this, he says, well, Descartes, the cogito ergo sum, is considered, ultimate truth in Western society, that the mind can be objective, can separate from everything else and observe, and the only thing is that the mind can observe. But he says that what if Descartes, and that the mind is separate. What if Descartes lived in China? Would he become this big hero? And no, he wouldn't, because you have this whole notion of the individual developing in ancient Greece and through Christianity that does not exist in the East. Interestingly enough, as we're tackling the problems of too much intellectual static patterns ruling everything, more Eastern thought is entering the picture, and not in just that kind of on the fringes. Eastern and ancient thought are entering the picture, trying to get back something we've lost, but we'll talk about that in a minute. The metaphysics of quality resolves the relationship between intellect and society, subject and object, mind and matter, by embedding all of them in a larger system of understanding. Objects are inorganic and biological values. Objects are inorganic and biological values. Objects. Subjects are social and intellectual values. They are not two mysterious universes that go floating around in some subject-object dream that allows them no real contact with one another. They have a matter-of-fact evolutionary relationship. That evolutionary relationship is also a moral one. So that's a good quote, and we don't need to explain that too much. We know that the morality he means is that these levels evolved from the lower level to facilitate the freedom of the lower level, are meant to protect the lower level, but need to be in charge when push comes to shove. Within this evolutionary relationship, it is possible to see that intellect has functions that predate science and philosophy. The intellect's evolutionary purpose has never been to discover an ultimate meaning of the universe. That's a relatively recent fad. Interestingly enough, you and I are probably under the misapprehension that intellect's evolutionary purpose is to find ultimate meaning of the universe. What are we doing here? Because this is our big thing, we think that this is intellect's big thing. I mean, I'm not saying you do, but I'm saying that Probably part of you does. Its historical purpose has been to help a society find food, detect danger, and defeat enemies. It can do this well or poorly, depending on the concepts it invents for this purpose. So the intellect works with society. And so if you're looking for the origins of intellect, it's not so much maybe when tools were invented, but it is when people learned how to band together and hunt, let's just say, maybe. So the origin of the intellectual level, that's an interesting one. I don't have an answer for that. I think it's kind of up for grabs. So problems arise when that original purpose is forgotten, that we're supposed to help the social level, and the social level is supposed to help us, or, us when I mean the individual intellectual person. And it's forgotten in this day and age because technology, we have this big barrier that helps us forget it, which is why we're doing such a poor job of handling COVID. I mean, I'm not saying that there aren't certain things that are kind of amazing, like getting a vaccine in a year, whatever you think of the vaccine. But at the same time, and that is technology working against biology, but the way we freaked out over it, and, in something that was relatively... Now, COVID is dangerous. I'm not saying it's not, but we are kind of namby-pamby when it comes to things like this. We really freaked out about it a little bit as if it was the Black Plague in a lot of ways. Psychologically, it felt like that because we have such a huge barrier between us and nature at this point that we're having difficulty handling it. So I don't know what that says about us. We've lost ways of dealing with biology. We don't understand nature. I'm not talking about everyone, but in general, your average educated upper middle class person who probably is in this corner, although this corner does have some understanding that we do have to get back to nature, so that's being a little bit unfair. But let's just say your average upper middle class educated person would not survive very long in the wild. Let me put it that way. So in a way, we're too protected, and maybe one of the things we need to get back is how to deal with nature. And that's a thought for another video. The Metaphysics of Quality suggests that the social chaos of the 20th century can be relieved by going back to this point of departure and re-evaluating the path taken from it. Intellect can support static patterns of society without fear of domination by carefully distinguishing those moral issues that are social biological from those that are intellectual social, and making sure there's no encroachment each ways. So we're conflating, and in the COVID response, we conflated these two moral codes. We have the biological, and then which is COVID and how to deal with it, and then we had the intellectual social. We attributed COVID, a biological pathogen, became this huge political problem. It became an idea that divided us, and became a set of ideas that frequently did not have anything to do with the actual virus. So a perfect example of that problem where there was encroachment is some of our COVID response. Not all of it. Some was good, but the parts that are screwed up are because of that reason. The elite are blaming the working class for COVID spread, and the working class are blaming the elite for stifling, or not just the working class, but anyone with half a brain really is angry at the elite for stifling valid responses to this pathogen by labeling things like ivermectin, which I know it's not proven, but to completely suppress that, for example, is a problem, is seeing that the desire for something like ivermectin is a social ill rather than something that directly responds to the biological problem. In the battle of society against biology, the new 20th century intellectuals have taken biology's side. Society can handle biology alone by means of prisons and guns and police and the military, but when the intellectuals in control of society take biology's side against society, then society is caught in a crossfire from which it has no protection. So the one thing that this good example of this is that it's okay to have sex with whoever you want, anytime, any place. That's an example of the intellectual level saying that this thing is okay and not looking at any of the problems, societal problems that would come from that. So that's one example. Another example of this dynamic is defund the police, and we're going to talk about that in a minute because it actually comes up in this chapter. And so here's an important paragraph to understand metaphysics of quality. The metaphysics of quality says that there are not just 2 codes of morals. There are actually 5. Inorganic, chaotic. Biological, inorganic. Social, biological, intellectual, social, and dynamic, static. This last, the dynamic static code, says what's good in life isn't defined by society or intellect or biology. What's good is freedom from domination by any static pattern, but that freedom doesn't have to be obtained by the destruction of the patterns themselves. So there's a harmony that has to occur for a static pattern to be very high quality. It has to understand the morality of the lower level, and it has to be able to update its own self. And so it has to be open to dynamic quality, but it has to be established enough to have some holding power. And ultimately, the dynamic static code is the metaphysics of all the codes. If you don't have the capacity for updating, then the morality of the upper level can be questionable. And sometimes it's better actually to have a dynamic pattern of the lower level than a 2 static pattern of the upper level. So this is where this all gets complicated, because if you have these 5 interacting moralities, these 4 interacting moralities plus static dynamic, there is no, it's not that cut and dry to make a moral decision based on the metaphysics of quality. And in fact, you can make arguments in many different directions. So what he's going to talk a lot about as an example of not understanding the conflating different moral levels morality is the hippies, because the hippies object to both social rules and to intellectual rules, and they embrace biology. But it can be explained. Hippies were kind of against everything that prevented, like they felt this sense of freedom, and they didn't want to be dominated by any level at all. They wanted direct access to biological. It was kind of a, let's just say, a catharsis, because you still had, you had a fairly rigid social system. Rigel, for example, is a product of 50s morality, and it was fairly rigid. And then you had from the above, you had the intellectual level that was too dominant and was oppressive in their own right. So both society and intellect, academia, etc., were oppressive, and the hippies wanted to break free from that and go into the biological level, which actually sounds a lot like Lila. So if in the beginning, when he said that she has biological quality, but that doesn't explain everything. He said, biologically she does, socially she doesn't, but that doesn't explain everything. So what you're looking at is someone who is not interested in either, who is kind of like a hippie, let's just say. And so what does that mean? Lila is more dynamic than anything, just like the hippies were. The hippie rejection of social and intellectual patterns left just 2 directions to go, toward biological quality and toward dynamic quality. The revolutionaries of the 60s thought that since both are antisocial and both are anti-intellectual, why then they must be the same. That was the mistake. What he's going to say in this chapter, and I'm going to read a long passage here, and I'm sorry about that, but it says it so much better. Then I can't really, I don't see any way of condensing this in any better way, or that it'd be useful to condense this, so I'm going to read the whole thing. And this is about too much dynamic quality. Back in the 50s and 60s, Friedrich had shared this confusion of biological quality and dynamic quality. But the metaphysics of quality seemed to help clear it up. When biological quality and dynamic quality are confused, the result isn't an increase in dynamic quality. It's an extremely destructive form of degeneracy, of the sort seen in the Manson murders, the Jonestown madness, and the increase of crime and drug addiction throughout the country. What's coming out of the urban slums, where old Victorian social moral codes were almost completely destroyed, isn't any new paradise the revolutionaries hoped for, but a reversion to rule by terror, violence, and gang death, the old biological might makes right morality of prehistoric brigandage that primitive societies were set up to overcome. Now, that would not go well in this particular... that wouldn't go over well in this political climate, and that is a lot of the problem that we would have. We're going to talk a little bit more about this, implementing the metaphysics of quality in this political climate. Any dynamic situation is vulnerable to attrition and corruption and even to complete collapse. When you take steps forward into the unknown, you always risk being smashed by that unknown. It's a war of society against patterns of reason and patterns of biology that have been set loose by the mistakes of this century. So that's a really pithy assessment of the problems. So basically what he's saying is dynamic quality is meant to update, to be a go-between between levels and or update patterns. It has its role, but on its own, it just is going to wash everything away. It's going to give the impression that all this stuff is bullshit, all the intellectual and the social stuff is bullshit, and you're just going to do what the hell you want. Well, what happens when you do what the hell you want? You end up in this totally biological situation. You revert to that because you don't have any of these safeguards against it. You've thrown out the patterns and you are contending with biology pretty much anew. I mean, obviously not 100%. You don't go back to the cavemen or anything like that. But some of the stuff is maintained. But for the point of this argument, it's biological enough that it's a big mess. The right and the left, conservatives and liberals, essentially need to work together. And there are times when the right is just too rigid. And that happened in the 90s. And then you have times when the left is just too dynamic. And you have that now. You have some great things that happened, with civil rights and gay rights and all that stuff. And then you have this weird mirror, these weird ghosts of that are completely detached from civil rights and are their own thing. And that's a lot of the strange racial and gender stuff that you're seeing nowadays that doesn't really make any sense and isn't really helping anyone, and are just ideas floating around out there dynamically on their own. So you have this problem. We're talking about the hippies where this got started, but you also have this problem now in the intellectual world, which is the left academics have kind of evolved from the hippies. They still have that kind of freedom, biological mindset, dynamic mindset, but now they have these ideas, and the ideas themselves are too free. They're too dynamic. They're too severed from their original purpose. A few of the hippies grew up and then they went to university, and that was the whole beginning of postmodernism. I know that that's not a very good history of postmodernism. I know it comes from something else. But this idea that you can completely sever from the social level is the origin of postmodernism, as far as I can tell. What seemed to allow this deadly night, and when he's talking about deadly night, he quotes Rudyard Kipling, and the deadly night is Calcutta. And Calcutta in the late 1800s was probably quite the place to behold. What seemed to allow this deadly night to descend was that the intellectual patterns that were supposed to be in charge of things, that should comprehend the threat and lead the fight against it, were paralyzed. They were paralyzed not by any external force, but by their own internal construction, which made them unable to comprehend what was happening. This perfectly describes having your hands tied because these ideas are floating around dynamically, and they're not attached to anything. So all you can do is mess around with the ideas, and then wonder why they don't actually, all this messing around with ideas, you're actually thinking that the ideas are the thing that they refer back to. But since you've completely annihilated any understanding of the social level, you were misinformed. These ideas are pretty much ideas of themselves with little vestiges of the social situations that they came from. So this paragraph also describes the social media bubbles that keep us from seeing solutions outside the dichotomy. I think it does, at least. Friedrich thought that a metaphysics of quality could be a replacement for the paralyzing intellectual system that is allowing all this destruction to go unchecked. So there again is the mixture of the unhinged or unmoored dynamic ideas that you can't do anything with. The paralysis of America is a paralysis of moral patterns. Morals can't function normally because morals have been declared intellectually illegal, and we're talking about social morals, by the subject-object metaphysics that dominates present social thought. These subject-object patterns were never designed for the job of governing society. They're not doing it. When they're put in the position of controlling society, of setting moral standards and declaring values, and when they then declare that there are no values and no morals, the result isn't progress. The result is social catastrophe. And that's everything I was saying about these ideas floating around unmoored. In the second part of this chapter, Pirsig uses this 5-point moral model he's just discussed in a true life situation, and that is the social turmoil of the 60s and its aftermath. And the curious thing is so many parallels with our own culture, and in this case we're going to talk about racial issues. So just like today, the liberal intellectuals love the liberal underdog and hate the conservative underdogs. Cops are hated. They were called the pigs back then. They're blue-collar, uneducated thugs, whereas minority criminals are simply that way due to oppression, and that their rights have been systematically denied. The cops' morality is social, an anathema of the intellectuals, whereas the morality of these criminals, because not any reason to do with their own biological phenotypes or anything like that, which he's going to talk about, but because in the ghetto, biological law of the streets now rules. And the intellectuals have sided with biological morality, and this is what you get. This is what you get when you deny that things like marriage and going to church can really help people who may not have the same financial resources, the upper middle class does. So it projects onto, they've separated themselves, they have the money and the power, and they project those morals onto, let's just say, more impoverished people. And they're mad at the blue-collar people because they retain some of these morals that they now think are, just bunk. And they annihilate, because they tend to meddle with poor people, which is part of the problem. They get in there and they meddle too much with these ideologies and strip away any kind of social safeguard that poorer societies have. And what you end up with is, again, law of the streets. And then they say, well, it's okay. They're okay because they're oppressed. That's the reason. When they don't even see that they themselves have caused the problem. And that is something that the elite, upper middle class, ruling class, whatever you want to call, will not admit. But that I think is a fact. And one of the things that needs to happen is to stop meddling. But Pirsig has a different solution. What passed for morality within this crowd was kind of a vague, amorphous soup of sentiments. Okay, here you go. Known as human rights. You were supposed to be reasonable. What these terms really meant was never spelled out in any way Friedrich had ever heard. You were just supposed to cheer for them. So these reasonable morals will solve everything, because church and family, to some extent, you're seeing this today in the furthest fringes of the left, that things like family are oppressive. But the problem is, of course, trying to understand human rights from a scientific perspective is impossible. We've already been through this whole problem with objective anthropology. All you can do is formulate vague concepts based on objective observation. In this case, the favored underclass and formulate what they should have based on objectivity and reason. If we can just get rid of systemic racism, if we can just do this, that, and the other thing, then everything's going to be fine. That's the reasonable scientific way of looking at it. And not understanding that by annihilating, by facilitating the destruction of the social level, that this biological law has emerged and everything is worse. In the and that isn't to say that things are worse on the intellectual level. They certainly are better. So I want to give the intellectual level its due, the social intellectual morality of making sure that on paper, in the law, in the law of the land, that there are absolutely equal rights, and that is where it really worked. And that is part of the reason that we've kind of lulled ourselves into believing that this intellectual solution is the be-all and end-all, because civil rights, it was a magnificent idea that really worked. In the Metaphysics of Quality, human rights are real intellectual values of freedom from outdated social restraint, which was the whole point of the intellectual level to begin with, but it's now gone too far. These Metaphysics of Quality human rights are about freedom from the lower level. The intellect's objective human rights are formulations from the laboratory of thought, disconnected from reality. These reasonable intellectual values have severed whole scale from the social level and dismissed the values altogether. What's more, the intellectual level decrees that freedom from the fetters of society, freed from the fetters of society, man's true and good nature will shine through. And we certainly have demonstrated this with the canonization, let's say, of criminals over these summer riots, without actually acknowledging that these criminals who were canonized and who died in really the most disgraceful circumstances, no doubt, but that doesn't make them good people. It just doesn't. Sorry. So what the intellects forget is that the social level and the police prevent the emergence of true danger, which is unfettered biological values. And therefore the rioting and looting during the summer was excused as an understandable response to years of social repression. And the criminals involved were actually considered victims. Society exists primarily to free people from these biological chains. It has done that job so stunningly well, intellectuals forget the fact and turn upon society with a shameful ingratitude for what society has done. Today we are living in an intellectual and technological paradise and a moral and social nightmare because the intellectual level of evolution, in its struggle to become free of the social level, has ignored the social level's role in keeping the biological level under control. Intellectuals have failed to understand the ocean of biological quality that is constantly being suppressed by social order. So this ingratitude really needs to be addressed. Old morality should, as he so viscerally puts it, dusted off and examined for things that we can actually use, for things that are good, for things that can help during turmoil when biology is threatening. We're talking in this case two ways that, two pathologies, the biological rule of law that is really undermining a lot of people in poor neighborhoods, and the inability to deal with COVID in a way that is socially responsible. It's been biologically responsible. It's been in a lot of ways. I mean, the vaccines, maybe not not using the therapies. In a way, it's been biologically responsible. We use technology, but socially, it's been very irresponsible. So this means taking the social level seriously again and seeing just where biology is threatening to society and where society are banding together, let's just say, in an integrated way, would actually be better for a biological threat. I mean, imagine this whole COVID situation with the rapid vaccine and the ability to address therapeutics in a saner way, different points of view, different needs, not, demonizing each other. Imagine how less pathological this whole this whole pandemic would have been if we weren't so divided. So racial problems, while much better in terms of equality of opportunity and laws, etc., as we've been talking about, are much worse in terms of protecting the very social level that gets people up and out of poverty. That social level which includes things like nuclear family, God, and social responsibility, all which the intellectual level have long denounced. And fear of being seen as racist continues to paralyze the intellectual level. The root of the racism charge, says Pirsig, is that the intellectual level, using the subject-object metaphysics, which we've been talking about throughout, is lumping biological man with cultural man. So if you speak out against a man's culture, you're speaking out against the man himself. Now here's something that Pirsig said that would that would get him canceled. Cultures can be graded and judged morally according to their contribution to the evolution of life. A culture that supports the dominance of social values over biological values is an absolutely superior culture to one that does not. And a culture that supports the dominance of intellectual values over social values is absolutely superior to one that does not. And there's no doubt about that. However, if you have a culture that is rather biological, which you do see in poverty, to say that this culture, to come up with any excuse under the sun that this culture is not functioning properly, besides the fact that they're far too closely embedded in biology, is absolutely something you cannot say in this day and age. Pirsig reflects that science says there's no morality outside of cultural morality. Therefore, any moral censorship of minority patterns of crime in the city, New York, is itself immoral. That is the paralysis. That is a very, very insightful sentence. And this, of course, means that if the culture sways towards the biological, we just need to let it be. If that causes a problem, just throw money at it. But under no circumstance hold that culture accountable. Because the intellectual level has tried to solve cultural problems with ideas, and one of those ideas being systemic racism is responsible for all the problems, versus what really is responsible. Yes, it's all right. Let's just say the people employing systemic racism, we're going to say that this is the white people with white privilege. All right, those people with white privilege are ostensibly are responsible, but it's not because of systemic racism as much as it is the ruling class tamping down of cultural freedom with the oppressive ideas of what is reasonable instead of what is good, which is allowing cultures to be what's reasonable is giving a bunch of is saying that this is systemic racism. That's logical, and throwing money at the problem. That's also logical and reasonable in this mindset of ideas where where society is just a bunch of problems that need to be done away with so we can handle things in a reasonable way. I'm going to propose that the solution to this problem is allowing the cultures to be in charge of solving their own problems, and obviously the elite having all the funds, helping if need be, but not getting in there and trying to fix it from this upper level. You know, these ideas come down and they're useful, things like civil rights, things like equality. But when you start perpetuating this idea conglomerate, in order to maintain that idea conglomerate, then you're getting something that is not dynamic. No wonder the well-meaning academic in this chapter throws up his hands in frustration. We've tried everything and nothing's worked, he says, which means we've tried all these reasonable ideas and things just keep getting worse and worse in the ghetto. What the intellectual level has not tried is allowing this culture, these people, these equal individuals to trust their culture to unfold without meddling with these damn ideas. And the intellectual ideas of civil rights and equality were excellent, obviously, because they used social patterns, because it was a mixture of good intellectual ideas and extant social patterns. Things like the war on poverty, however, and subsequent social programs perhaps are not such good ideas, perhaps are meddling, because these things cause stagnation and keep dynamic quality out that is needed for autonomy and agency. Now, I know I'm sounding, this sounds like right-wing talking points, but they're not. And I'm sorry that to say something like this would put me outside the realm of the blue checkmark people. Because remember, at the bottom of the intellectual level is subject-object metaphysics, and truth to the intellectual level of today is science. That's why this statement is so important in understanding just why we're paralyzed on racial and other cultural identity issues. In fact, all identity issues are conflating biological people with cultural people and allowing biology to win. Anything goes, as long as, because of your phylogenics, just follow the phylogenics and anything goes, and you end up with this weird stuff because you don't have a cultural, you don't have a society that supports and keeps people in line. You have these ideas that allows biology to win. Again, these individuals, these subject-object oriented, these intellects operating in the subject-object world can understand and believe in science, but not in society, which is explained away with science. So the antidote is to deal with biological people on one level and cultural people on another. People are multi-level. They're biological, social, intellectual. Every level is capable of response to quality, and every level is capable of being tamped down. It's the social man now that needs repair. It's like dusting off these supposedly defunct and oppressive social patterns and seeing how they can help, not going back to the 50s, but taking some of these patterns from the 50s and potentially updating them to modern life. How can you have more supportive society? How can you have more supportive family? How can you have more supportive community? One thing we have to do, if we're going to divide, if we're going to address the different levels, is we're going to have to be colorblind. We're going to have to judge people by the content of their character, etc. And the freedom to discuss this is being stymied now because free speech, that great dynamic social pattern, is now considered problematic. It is immoral to speak against a people because of the color of their skin or any other genetic characteristics, because these are not changeable and don't matter anyway. Yes, but it is not immoral to speak against a person because of cultural characteristics, because of his cultural characteristics, if those cultural characteristics are immoral. These are changeable and they do matter. Therefore, the value of the social level and the necessity to favor it over the biological, which would do far more to help the very people white intellectuals profess, or white and, now we're talking about a really multiracial upper class, profess to care about, is shot down, but the social level is still there, however much the intellectuals deny it. And it emerges in the intellectual unconscious as religion. You could call it Kindangeloism, as it's been called. I think John McWhorter called it that. And this allows intellectuals to remain in their immune system of ideas, pay penance for this systemic racism without ever venturing into the ghetto, or without ever actually having to meet a poor black person. So it's a win-win situation for the intellectual elite, and does jack SHIT for the people who really need the help. It's a war of biological blacks and biological whites against social blacks and social whites. Genetic patterns just confuse the matter. And this is a war in which intellect, to end the paralysis of society, has to know which side it's on and support that side, never undercut it. Where biological values are undermining social values, intellectuals must identify social behavior, no matter what its ethnic connection, and support it all the way without restraint. Intellectuals must find biological behavior, no matter what its ethnic connection, and limit or destroy destructive biological patterns with complete moral ruthlessness, the way a doctor destroys germs, before those biological patterns destroy civilization itself. And of course, with fingers in our ears, we would call this a violation of human rights and more evidence of systemic racism. However, this is the antidote, and we're not ready, and we're suffering because of it. So I hope that made sense, and I'll see you next time.